of memorials, such as Mount Rushmore, which you might know. I should have put a picture here. Mount Rushmore is that giant sculpture of 4 presidents' heads, which is really quite impressive to see as well. The National Park Service, as I mentioned in previous lectures, is a job with the National Park Service is a really desirable position. These are competitive positions. They're highly coveted. And it's something that I always encourage my history students to look into, even if they don't think they've got a shot. Why not try? Because these are great places to work if you are interested in history, if you're interested in the United States history, if you're interested in nature, geology, any of those kinds of things. So, all right, let's move forward to the first one. So we're going to be talking about Mammoth Cave National Park first. And so here's a map to sort of situate us so you know what we're talking about. So Mammoth Cave is here in sort of the south, I guess maybe the southwest of Kentucky, although it's pretty close to the center of Kentucky. It's right above Tennessee. So from where I live, I live down here in Alabama. So if I drove through Tennessee up to Kentucky, I could get to Mammoth Cave. It became a national park in 1941, but it actually has a much longer history than that. So a couple of things about Mammoth Cave National Park that are unique. This is one of the few parks that you can't just drive through. So many of the others that I've spoken about before, I've talked about the fact that you can, if you have mobility issues, if you're elderly, if you have little children, that a lot of those other parks have very nice driving roads. And so, you can still appreciate those parks without necessarily, getting out of your car very much. You don't have to be able to do anything necessarily in the way of hiking to enjoy some of the features of those other parks. Mammoth Cave is different. The whole thing is underground. So you really can't enjoy this park if you have serious mobility issues. It does require that you go and do some walking. It's not a great park for anyone with serious mobility issues. It's not a great park for people with little children because you'll really probably need to carry them for a lot of this one. So you have to be a little more adventuresome to participate in this park and its activities. So Mammoth Cave is famous because it is the longest cave system in the world. So I told you that it became a park in 1941, but it actually started to capture the public's attention in the early 19th century. So after the War of 1812, at that time, the area was actually, the property was owned by someone. And the current owner actually established a staff of slave guides and started to charge people for guided tours of part of the Mammoth Cave system. Eventually, subsequent owners expanded upon the cave's tourism potential and began to build support buildings on the property, including a hotel. And eventually in 1839, the hospital actually was used as, I'm sorry, the cave was actually used, or a portion of the cave was actually used as an underground hospital for patients with tuberculosis, because it seemed that the cool air in the cave was actually beneficial for tuberculosis patients. By the end of the 1800s, this cave had become a major tourist attraction. It drew many famous visitors, including William Jennings Bryan, the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro, and also Edwin Booth, who is the Shakespearean actor and brother to the man who would ultimately assassinate Abraham Lincoln. The cave was also visited by a Russian about whom I wrote a book. Russian Grand Duke Alexis, the son of the Tsar, came to visit the United States in 1871-72. And while he was here, he toured Mammoth Cave along with an entourage that included the famous American General George Armstrong Custer. And these are just a couple of images here that you can see, the one that shows you what Grand Duke Alexis looked like. And on the left, there was a special train that conveyed him to Mammoth Cave. And this was very typical of the time. During this event, there would be special time cards because the railroads would be closed for this royal train that was coming through. And so everybody had these special schedules to let them know that the Grand Duke was going to be traveling through. So it became a site for American tourists, but also when foreigners came to the United States, if they came to this area, they were brought to see Mammoth Cave because it was such an amazing spectacle. So this is a map of the entire cave system, and it's enormous. And I have to tell you, I was trying to get some clear numbers on the size of it, but I think that the problem is that there are various ways of measuring this. So you can measure the actual mileage of the cave system in terms of the areas that have been explored. And then you can measure the surface level of the land. And so it was difficult for me to come up with some exact numbers. And I think probably I just don't understand enough about the geology of caves to parse out the proper numbers. But as you can see from the map, it is an enormous cave system. And as I said, it is the longest cave system in the world. And I'm sure there are areas of it which have not been fully documented, though I suspect a lot of it has been at this point, right? So it's a pretty impressive cave system. Now, some of the features of the cave that are so impressive are these amazing stalactites and stalagmites. So I want to explain the difference for those of you who maybe have never been inside of a cave. So stalactites are the ones that come from the ceiling, and stalagmites are the ones that come from the floor. And these are formed by dripping dripping water that has minerals in it, right? A lot of lime and calcium, and that hardens and forms these kinds of pillars, right? So the way I always remember the difference is stalactites has a C in it, right? So I remember ceiling, and then stalagmites has a G, which I associate with ground. So that's how I remember the difference. But you can go through this cave and see some just amazing stalactites and stalagmites. And as in the photo on the left, occasionally they meet in the middle and then they become a column. Here's one of these amazing formations in Mammoth Cave. And it's almost like a waterfall has occurred over time and just been frozen as the minerals harden in this water. And there's of course, if you've ever been in one of these kinds of caves, there is a lot of dripping, a lot of water. You can hear it everywhere as you move through the cave. So when you go to Mammoth Cave, you can, I think, only enter with guided tours unless you've registered to hike it. And as you go on these amazing tours, you can see that there are some very big open spaces like this one, some that are big enough to actually have a concert in, and there are some that have names associated with that kind of thing. And then there are also some really tight spaces. There's one called, oops, let me go back, sorry. There's one called, I think it's called Fat Man's Misery or something along those lines. And it's like a very tight squeeze. So as you go through, there are areas that you have to walk that are sort of narrow paths. Sometimes you're having to duck your head. Sometimes you're having to squeeze between things. So it's, again, if you have any kind of claustrophobia, not a great thing to do, because even though some of the spaces are big, others are smaller, and you are, of course, underground, and it's not easy to get out quickly once you're in there. If you have mobility issues, it's not a great place to go. There are some other hiking, they call it spelunking when it's in a cave, right? There are some hiking in areas that, for example, I know that Boy Scouts and other groups do that are very, very tight, where you literally are crawling on your belly to squeeze through openings. And I knew someone who went on one of these, and several of them larger men had a very tough time in some of these areas. So again, this is a very different park, not one that you just cruise through in your car. And the biggest feature of it is this underground cave. So it's something that's really not available to everyone to see. There are other things in the larger park that you can do. So of course, when we looked at that map, there's there's grounds there, right? There's a lot of forest. So there are hiking trips there. There are places you can rent bikes. There's places you can ride horses. Of course, there are camping areas, and there are also places where you can go canoeing or kayaking. So lots of, wonderful outdoor activity around this central feature of the cave. All right, let's move on to the next one. So the next one is the Great Smoky Mountains. This is America's most visited park. So we talked about some of the other parks, Yellowstone in particular, that's pretty high up on that list, but this is the one that's visited by most people. The idea to create this park originated in the 1920s, but it only came to fruition in 1934 when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a bill making it into an official national park. It is a very big park. So you can see here's where it is. It's in North Carolina, and it borders into Tennessee as well. It's a mountain range that rises along this border, and it's part of the Appalachian Mountains. The park covers something along the lines of 520,000 acres, or about 860 square miles. It's a really large forest park. Like the other national parks that we've talked about, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park has lots of activities for visitors. There's hiking, there's biking. This is one of the parks that you can also just drive through. So, there are roads that go through this park that are actually roads that connect, from one part of the state to the other. So this is actually something you drive through. One of the most famous things that's associated with this large forest park is its fall foliage. So people come here every fall to see the leaves change. And I have driven through here. I can't remember if that's photos mine or not, but even when the foliage is not considered at its best, it's still beautiful. So I grew up in the South where we don't get a whole lot of fall foliage. Things stay green year round. And especially where I grew up in Louisiana, literally it was green all year long. But so I'm impressed with any amount of fall foliage. I think it's beautiful, even if it's not the best that people have ever seen. And so even if it's not the best, you can go there and you can see some really lovely fall foliage. And because you're looking across these mountain ranges, the spectacular colors are really quite striking because there's so much of it. You just look off into the distance and you see so much fall foliage. Another thing that is famous about this park is that a portion of it contains something called the Appalachian Trail. So you might have heard of this before. It's pretty famous. It's a 72-mile trail that's almost like a pilgrimage for serious hikers. So anybody who's very much into hiking sort of, might aspire to do the Appalachian Trail. And it's pretty tough. Only about 1 in 4 people actually make it from beginning to end. I've never done it because I'm not a serious hiker, but I know from reading about it and from talking to people who have done it that, as you do the Appalachian Trail, there are places that are set up along the way for people doing the trail. So there are places where you can buy necessary materials. There are places where you can actually mail things to yourself in advance so that when you get to a certain point in your hike, you can get a box of supplies to replenish the things that you've already used. There are hotels along the way. There are, places where you can go and get medical attention if you need it. So this is a really big deal. And for people who are very much into hiking, being able to say that they completed the Appalachian Trail is like running a marathon. So it's and that is part of this system of mountains. So it's a famous thing that people do here. So if any of you are serious hikers, it might be something you want to try one day. Okay, here's some more pictures of the beautiful fall foliage. Again, like I mentioned before, unlike some of the other parks that I mentioned, like the Yellowstone, or I'm sorry, Mammoth Cave, here you can drive through. So you can see there's a road there that takes you right through the park. Every fall, people do just come driving through here. So you don't even have to make it a whole trip. You don't have to spend the night. You can just drive through during the day and appreciate the beautiful colors. Now, of course, like some of the other trees, I don't know what I'm stumbling over my words. Like some of the other parks that we've talked about, right? There are lovely animals here, and if it's a quiet day and especially at dawn or early morning and around dusk, you might get lucky and see some of these animals. But of course, during the peak seasons when there are lots of cars around, you tend to see fewer because they're avoiding the cars as you might expect they would. Okay, so let's go over to our last park now, and that is the Everglades. So again, we have today here a park that is very different from the ones that we've talked about before. So all of the ones we've talked about before have been, either rock formations, right? Geological formations, lots of stone, lots of trees, forested areas. But this park is all about water, right? So this is a park that is very much about an ecosystem that depends on water. So you're not going to see any rock formations here. Now, the Everglades, here's a map, shows you where this is. Again, another very large park. It's at the very southern tip of the state of Florida. So, the southernmost point in the United States, basically. And it consists of 1.5 million acres of wetlands and adjacent areas. And it is an ecosystem that has a great deal of biodiversity. So let's look at the next slide. So as I said before, you can see here, this is a park that is really very wet, right? This is a park that is based on water. A lot of the activities then, a lot of the things that you do in this park are related to water, involve being around water or on the water. So you can see even the walkways that take you through the park are built above water. So you're going to be walking through a lot of wet areas as you go through this, but they've set it up very nicely for pedestrians so that you can enjoy a lot of this without actually needing to, travel by boat or something, right? The park also has two very distinct seasons. So there is a dry season, which tends to be from December to April. And then there is a wet season, which is from May to November. Now, the dry season, which is from December to April, is the busy season. So this is when it's recommended that people view the park if they can. It's the peak time of tourism in the park. And part of that is because of the animals that appear during this time. So this warm winter temperature attracts a variety of birds and the animals who eat them. It also tends to be, of course, cooler. It's not quite as hot as it would be during the summer in Florida. And of course, that also means that there are fewer mosquitoes and other types of flying insects that might make the park unenjoyable. If you go in the summertime, it's going to be a lot hotter. It will be more humid, so the temperature will be high, but also the air will be moister. And it also means that there will be lots more mosquitoes. And I know that, everybody's had experience with horrible mosquitoes, and that can really ruin a trip, right? It's very, very hard to enjoy yourself when there are things buzzing around your face, unless you're really into the great outdoors and that kind of thing doesn't faze you. So that's part of the reason that people tend to try and go in the winter time. Now, because this is such a different type of park, conservation here is very different. So when we talked about some of the other parks, I'm sorry, we talked about the fact that fire often was a concern, right? In a lot of these other parks, they have to worry about forest fires, they have to worry about droughts, because these are areas that can be prone to drought. Sometimes, they have dry spells, and then everything gets very, very dry. The trees get very dry. And then, of course, all it takes is a careless person with a match or even a lightning strike or something else that might start a forest fire out west. Here, conservation's very, very different, right? Conservation here has to do with preserving that very delicate Everglades ecosystem, which requires the proper balance of water between the quantity, the quality, the timing of when the water is being added to the ecosystem, and the distribution of water. So as part of this conservation, there's something called the hydraulic monitoring program. And so there are people who are employed by the park. They're called hydrologists, whose job is to monitor the condition of the fresh water, the brackish water, the salt water, and all of these water resources within the park. And they have a very extensive and complex system of monitoring sites and also monitoring stations. So again, you can tell this is a very different ecosystem and a very different conservation effort than the ones that we've spoken about out west. And so what these hydrologists are doing is they're collecting data about the movement of water, the content of the water, the condition of the surface and the groundwater resources, to monitor how those are changing over time and to make recommendations about how to continue to conserve this area. In addition, biologists and ecologists also are concerned with monitoring and evaluating other things about the park. So the biological, chemical, and environmental factors that might affect water quality. These include things like contamination, pollution, right? Some of this would be the result of natural events. So hurricanes, we just had Hurricane Helene here or Helena here in the United States, right? So those kinds of things can blow in and change a lot of the balance of the water in the area. It can disrupt plant life. It can disrupt animal life, right? So those kinds of things have to be examined. But also, of course, these park hydrologists and biologists are looking at what humans do and how that affects the ecosystem in the park. So pollution always affects water. Of course, we know that. Human beings dump a lot of stuff into water. Air pollution can affect those things as well. And so this is stuff that the scientists in this park are constantly monitoring, because so much of the park is about water, and the animals are depending on the water to live well, right? The other thing that this park has to deal with, which is not so much a case in other parks, or at least not in the same way, is the problem of invasive non-native species. So one of the animals that has been particularly problematic in this park is the Burmese python. So these enormous snakes have come to live in the Everglades when people either intentionally release them into the park. So people will adopt these animals, these snakes, when they're small. And then, as you can see from the photograph, they get really, really large. So at some point, people maybe discover that this is too large for them. They can't handle it anymore. And they release it into the park intentionally. They think, I'll just let it go into nature, right? Sometimes the snakes escape their enclosures and they end up in the park. But in either case, you've got an enormous snake, which doesn't belong there, that's now living in this ecosystem. And of course, they then do what animals do. They start to hunt and they eat things. And of course, if they're not native to the area, then that disrupts the ecosystem. So Burmese python have contributed to a significant decline in the mammals in the park. And so there are ongoing efforts to raise awareness about these kinds of snakes and what the proper thing to do is if you suddenly discover you can no longer take care of a snake. And there are also ongoing efforts to capture and relocate these snakes as well. In fact, there is an annual contest that happens every year over a 10-day period. And during this period, people can win cash prizes for killing the most pythons. And here is a photograph of some of the people who have participated in this. The woman on the left, I forget what they call her. She has a nickname, but she's famous for capturing pythons, apparently. But in 2023, for example, so last year, the contest resulted in the killing of 209 pythons. So that gives you an idea of just how many of those pythons are out there. And of course, they're doing their best to get them under control, but probably for every one that they capture, there's probably another one out there. So it's an ongoing effort, not one I'm interested in participating in, but it's pretty interesting to see the photographs from it. Now, of course, there are also other animals living in the park. And so, for example, we have alligators and crocodiles. So alligators tend to have the rounder nose, and crocodiles tend to have the pointier nose. So you can see examples of both of those here. So there are lots of alligators and crocodiles living in the Everglades Park as well. A lot of people come here to see birds. So there are lots of water birds who live in the park. Here you can see some lovely pictures of flamingos. This on the right, I think, is a heron or an egret, but in either case, there are both egrets and herons living in the park as well. So lots of these larger water birds are make their home in this park. And then other birds stop here on migration patterns as well. And then finally, one of the things that the park is famous for is the manatee population. So manatees are these large animals. I think sometimes they're referred to as sea cows because they're these big, kind of blubbery sea creatures. They mostly eat seagrass, so they're mostly herbivores, although sometimes they do eat some fish. People just love these giant, slow-moving creatures because they look very gentle and sweet, especially the big pictures of the babies, like the one on the bottom here. They have no natural predators, so they're protected mostly from humans. So they are protected by the government. They are shallow water swimmers, feeding on grasses. And so the reason we have to look out for them is because they can get injured by human interaction. So when humans are in boats, for example, they might accidentally hit one of these manatees with propellers or something and injure them or kill them. They're not deep divers. They don't have that ability, and so it's not within their ability to dive deep and get out of the way of these boats. So there are lots of rules about, certain areas where, you cannot go with any kind of like motorized boat because you might injure or kill a manatee. There are places here, by the way, where you can pay to go swimming with manatees. I haven't ever done that, but it is something that people do pay to do. What are some other activities in the park? Well, as I mentioned, there are some elevated pathways. So here's an example down here in the lower left. So there are hiking trails that you can go on. Again, very different from the kind of hiking trails we talked about in the other parks where you'd be like climbing mountains and stuff like that. Here you'll be looking at nature in a different way. There are some biking trails as well. But a lot of the activities, not surprisingly, have to do with water. So you can go kayaking, canoeing. There are boat tours like the one here up in the upper left-hand side of the slide. There are things like alligator tours or crocodile tours to see specific types of wildlife, manatees, those kinds of things. So lots of water activities in this park. But again, within certain areas, because some areas are off limits to protect the animals. So I've concluded all of my lectures about the national parks with just some basic advice about visiting these parks. So if you wanted to come and visit any of these parks, you should always plan far ahead. So if you just happen to be in Florida and you wanted to go to the Everglades, you could do that. But some of the things that you might want to do would be off limits. So then, things might be closed, or there might be a timed entry for certain things. And so you definitely want to try and plan in advance for these things if you can, especially when it comes to accommodations and specific activities. If you're good with kind of just going with the flow and see what you can see, then it's fine. But if you have any kind of specific plans, interests, you want to definitely check that out in advance, because these are all busy parks. And as I've mentioned in previous lectures, some of them even are, contemplating timed entry, all kinds of other ways of kind of limiting access so that the area can be preserved. There's no desire to turn these into things that people can't get to. We don't want them to become elite or exclusive designations, but really the goal is to make sure that the areas are protected. The other thing, of course, is to check the weather, both for accessibility and packing reasons. So again, in some of these parks, like Smoky Mountains, there are places where there will be snow. And so you want to know about the cold weather. But, on the opposite end of things, you'd want to know about the warm weather in a place like the Everglades, and you'd want to think about what you should pack and, what the best time to visit would be. In Mammoth Cave, if you're going to, even if you're just going to do, it's a guided tour, you want to think about maybe packing a windbreaker or a light jacket, because in parts of the cave system, it can get kind of cool. And if you're prone to being cold, you might want something, right? It's not going to be super cold, but it can be a little chilly underground. And then, of course, I always conclude with some warnings about just being safe when you're in these parks. So it's very tempting to try and get those perfect pictures, especially now that we're all posting pictures of ourselves doing things on social media all the time. But there are safety barriers for a reason in all of these parks, and going beyond those safety barriers can be not only dangerous, but it can be deadly. And every year people do get hurt or die in situations like that. So you want to definitely follow those rules, stay behind the proper barriers, stay away from the animals. So we talked about buffalo or bison in other parks. Here, in the Everglades, for example, you're going to be talking about alligators and crocodiles. If you look at the teeth on those things, I don't think you want to get close. And then if you're doing any kind of hiking, of course, you want to make sure you have enough water. And in the Everglades, you're probably never too far from your car, I would imagine, on a regular hike. But, if you go in the summer, it's going to be very, very warm, and you want to be prepared for that. So I thank you for listening today, and I am happy to entertain questions. I'm going to go ahead and look in the chat room now and see if anybody has any questions.